Welcome to one of the most disturbing and shocking stories ever found in Louisiana history. Before we get started, drop in the comments where you're watching from and what exact time it is where you are. We really want to know which places and what times of day or night people are tuning in to hear stories like this. In the fall of 1844, a transaction was written down in the official records of St. Francisville, West Feliciana Parish, Louisiana. Those yellowed pages, now kept safe in the State Historical Archives, record the purchase of a woman named Clara Mayfield by a plantation owner named Henry Duval for just 12 cents, a price so weird that historians have been scratching their heads about it ever since. What the official record didn't mention was that Clara was pregnant, and what no document would ever write down was who the father of her baby was. The story of Henry Duval and Clara Mayfield might have stayed buried in the forgotten corners of American history forever if it hadn't been for a discovery made in 1963 when the old Duval Plantation house was about to be torn down. A construction worker found a metal box hidden under the floorboards of what used to be the master bedroom. Inside were letters, diary entries, and a small leather-bound account book that would shine a light on one of Louisiana's darkest family secrets. The Duval Plantation sat about 5 miles south of St. Francisville, on rich land that stretched from the Mississippi River all the way to the rolling hills of the region. The main house was 2 stories tall with big white columns and wide porches, totally typical of the grand old Southern style of that time. By all accounts, it was neither the fanciest nor the simplest plantation in Louisiana. What made it different wasn't how it looked, it was what went on inside its walls. Henry Duval was born in 1800 and came from a long line of plantation owners who had settled in Louisiana not long after France sold the territory to America. According to local records, he inherited the plantation after his older brother Richard Duval died unexpectedly in July of 1844. Richard had run the family business really successfully for almost 20 years. His death was officially blamed on a fever, though some accounts hint it might have been the result of a duel, which honestly wasn't that unusual for men of his status back then. Clara Mayfield's background is much harder to piece together. Slave records from that era are notoriously spotty, and Clara basically doesn't show up in any official paperwork until the moment Henry Duval bought her. Based on estimates from a doctor's notes found among the hidden documents, she was about 25 years old at the time, and she was described as being 5 months pregnant. What makes this case really unusual isn't just the ridiculously low price Henry paid for Clara, it's the whole story behind the transaction. According to the previous owner's ledger, which was most likely Richard Duval's personal record book, Clara had been sold off to a cotton plantation in Mississippi just 2 months before Richard died. The fact that she ended up back at the Duval plantation under Henry's ownership strongly suggests someone went out of their way to bring her back, though nobody knew why until those hidden documents were found. The papers reveal a complicated and twisting story that played out over several months after Richard's death and ended with events that local people would only talk about in hushed whispers for generations. This is the story of the Duval plantation, of Henry and Clara, and of a secret that would haunt that property long after everyone involved was gone. In the weeks after his brother's funeral, Henry made some big changes to how the plantation was run. The overseer, a man named Thomas Wilkins who had worked under Richard for 15 years, was fired without any explanation. Several house servants who had been close to Richard were moved out to the fields, and the master bedroom, Richard's old room, stayed locked up and unused. The neighbors noticed all of this with some serious side-eye. A nearby plantation owner's wife, Mrs. Eliza Montgomery, wrote in her diary in September 1844, "Mr. H. Duval appears determined to undo much of his brother's work. One wonders if jealousy might be at the root of such decisions, as Richard's success has cast a long shadow." What Mrs. Montgomery and everyone else around them didn't know was that Henry had found something in his brother's personal belongings, something that set off a chain of events that would eventually lead him to go hunt down and buy Clara Mayfield. According to a personal letter Henry wrote to his cousin in Virginia, never actually sent, but found among the hidden documents, he had come across some entries in Richard's private journal suggesting Richard had been involved in an inappropriate relationship with one of the household servants. The journal itself wasn't among the discovered items, and Henry's letter doesn't spell out exactly what he read, just calling it "conduct unbecoming a Duval and a stain upon our family name." What is clear from everything else that followed is that Henry became completely obsessed with tracking down Clara Mayfield after reading those journal entries. Bank records from Natchez show that Henry withdrew a big sum of money in early September, and travel receipts show he made a trip to Mississippi right after. By early October, Clara was back at the Duval Plantation, bought for that strange token price of 12 cents, which pretty much screams that there was way more going on than a normal sale. A doctor's report dated October 12, 1844, notes that Clara was about 5 months pregnant and in good health despite the rough travel she'd been through. The same document has a very telling note: patient confirms conception occurred in early May. Master requests this information be recorded officially. May of 1844 was 4 months before Richard Duval died. If Clara was 5 months pregnant in October, basic math puts the time she got pregnant right during the period when she was still living on the Duval plantation under Richard's ownership. Henry's reasons for bringing Clara back to the plantation became the subject of a lot of whispering among the few people who even knew what was going on. Some of the documents suggest he originally planned to confirm his suspicions about his brother and then sell Clara off to a plantation even further south. There's even a draft of a letter to a broker in New Orleans that says exactly that, but something changed in the weeks after Clara came back. The household accounts show she wasn't sent to work in the fields like you'd normally expect. Instead, she was given duties inside the house, specifically organizing and cataloging the library, a job that would require her to be able to read, which was actually a pretty rare skill among enslaved people at the time. This assignment meant she was around Henry regularly, and according to his own scattered journal entries, he started spending more and more time in that library. November brought the first frost to the region, and along with the cold came visitors to the Duval plantation. Henry's cousin from Virginia, James Duval, showed up with his wife for what was supposed to be a short stopover on their way to New Orleans. Their visit ended up stretching to nearly 3 weeks, and during that time, the first cracks in Henry's carefully constructed story started to show. James's wife, Catherine, described by people who knew her as someone who noticed everything and had absolutely no filter, zeroed in immediately on Clara's situation in the house. In a letter to her sister written after she left the plantation, she said, "The woman is clearly with child and yet is treated with a difference that borders on impropriety. When I made mention of this to Henry, his reaction was most severe. I fear there is something unwholesome in his interest in the woman's condition." By December, as Clara's pregnancy got further along, Henry's behavior started getting really erratic. The plantation's accounts started showing neglect. Supply orders went unfiled. Letters went unanswered. Decisions about winter planting were put off until almost too late. Records from the neighboring Montgomery plantation note that Henry was seen riding along the edges of his property at weird hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, like he was looking for something or someone. It was around this time that Henry started making major renovations to the east wing of the house, an area that had previously been used for storage rooms and a small study. Worker records show the rooms were being turned into what looked like private living quarters, which was unusual enough to set off gossip among both the house staff and the neighboring plantations. As the year wound down, the tension on the plantation just kept building. The new overseer who had replaced Thomas Wilkins reported having more and more trouble managing the field workers, saying that rumors about strange goings-on in the main house were messing with morale and getting in the way of work. In his report to Henry dated December 28, he wrote, "The men speak of sounds coming from the east wing at night. Some refuse to work near the house after sundown. I have administered discipline as needed, but the problem persists." Henry's response, scrawled at the bottom of the report, was short and cold: "Increase rations for the Christmas period. Any who continue to spread tales will be sold come spring." The new year of 1845 kicked off with an ice storm that locked down the whole region for almost a week. The plantation was completely cut off, roads were impassable, and the river was partly frozen. It was in those conditions on January 9th that Clara Mayfield gave birth. The doctor who had been looking after her couldn't make it through the weather. According to household records, the birth was attended by the cook, an older woman named Martha, and watched over by Henry himself, which was a completely unheard of level of involvement for a plantation owner. The baby was a boy, born just after midnight. No official birth record exists in the parish documents, but Henry did make an entry in the family Bible, another item found in the hidden stash. The entry simply reads, "A male child born to Clara, January 9, 1845. No name is recorded, and the space where a father's name would traditionally go was left completely blank. In the weeks after the birth, Henry's behavior got even stranger. The household accounts show he ordered fine fabric from New Orleans for baby clothes and had a cradle brought down from the attic, the same cradle, servants later said, that had been used for both Richard and Henry when they were babies. Clara and the baby were set up in the newly renovated rooms in the East Wing, and Henry gave strict orders that nobody was to bother them except Martha, who was assigned to help take care of the infant. His journal entries from this time are all over the place, jumping between fits of rage at his dead brother and what looks like a growing obsession with the child. "The eyes," he wrote on January 20th, "unmistakable, the same shape, the same color. Even Martha remarked upon it before I silenced her. How could he have been so careless, so selfish? The resemblance will only grow stronger with time." By February, word about the strange situation had started spreading beyond the plantation. The pastor of the church in St. Francisville came by, officially to check on the spiritual well-being of the household after the hard winter, but his real reason, as he later admitted in a letter to the bishop, was to look into rumors he'd been hearing about an inappropriate arrangement between Mr. Duval and an enslaved woman and her newborn baby. Henry refused to let the pastor pass the main sitting room and got visibly agitated whenever Clara or the baby came up in conversation. According to the pastor's account, Henry insisted that family matters are private concerns and strongly implied that the church might want to think twice about losing the Duval family's very generous annual donation if it couldn't respect that privacy. The pastor left without seeing either Clara or the child, but he was not reassured. In his letter to the bishop he wrote, "There is a darkness in that house that goes beyond the usual sins of men. I fear not just for the moral standing of Mr. Duval, but for the safety of those under his care." The pastor's worries were not wrong. By March, things on the Duval plantation had got even worse. The overseer quit, writing in his resignation letter that he could no longer bear the weight of unnatural practices taking place on the property. 3 field workers tried to escape, though they were caught and brought back. And Henry, according to his own scattered writings, had started spending nights sitting in a chair outside Clara's door, supposedly to protect her and the baby. Who or what exactly he thought he was protecting them from isn't spelled out, though his writings start bringing up over and over his belief that his dead brother's spirit was trying to claim the child. "I hear him in the walls," Henry wrote in early March, "his footsteps on the stairs. When the wind blows from the east, I can hear him calling the boy's name, the name he has no right to bestow." The baby still hadn't been officially named, though Henry had started calling him the heir in his private writings, which was a loaded thing to say given all the legal and social rules of the time. Clara's own feelings and experiences during all of this are basically missing from the historical record, which is sadly how it usually goes when it comes to enslaved people's perspectives. The little we do know comes from testimony given by Martha decades later, when she was interviewed as part of a Freedmen's Bureau documentation project in 1873. According to Martha, and keep in mind almost 30 years had passed by then, Clara was in a strange in-between position in those renovated East Wing rooms. She was given things that were unusual for someone in her situation: clean clothes, enough food, books, but she was not allowed to leave the East Wing without Henry's permission, which he almost never gave. "Miss Clara, she knew things weren't right," Martha recalled. "She kept that baby close, wouldn't let him out of her sight. When Master Henry came to visit, which was most every day and sometimes in the night, she would hold that child like she was afraid he might snatch him away." By April of 1845, the tension inside the Duval household had hit a breaking point. The plantation's output had dropped dramatically, and the neighboring landowners had started pulling back from Henry, ignoring his invitations and leaving him off the guest lists for the usual social gatherings. In mid-April, Henry made the surprise decision to travel to New Orleans, leaving the plantation under the watch of a quickly hired new overseer. According to travel documents and receipts found in his papers, he stayed in the city for just over a week, meeting with a lawyer and making changes to his will, a copy of which was included in the discovered documents. The will, dated April 23, 1845, contained some pretty jaw-dropping provisions. Most significantly, it stated that the male child born to Clara, currently living at Duval Plantation, should upon Henry's death be granted his freedom and transported to a northern state where arrangements would be made for his education and upbringing. A large sum of money was to be set aside in a trust for this purpose. The will also specified that Clara was to be freed upon Henry's death and given enough money to set herself up independently, whether she chose to go with the child or not. If she chose not to go north, she was to be placed with a household in New Orleans where her reading skills and household abilities would be valued and mistreatment would be forbidden. These conditions, if they had ever become public while Henry was alive, would have caused a massive scandal. Freeing enslaved people was technically legal in Louisiana at the time, but was getting harder and harder to do and was very much looked down upon socially. More revealing was the implication that Henry felt some kind of responsibility to the child, a responsibility that went way beyond what even the most unusually decent slave owner of the time would have been expected to feel. Henry came back from New Orleans on April 30th, bringing with him a new household manager, a French woman named Madame Beaumont, who according to her contract was hired specifically to oversee the education and proper upbringing of the child living in the East Wing. The contract specifically said she was to report only to Henry and was not to talk about her duties with anyone outside the household. Madame Beaumont's arrival changed the dynamic in the house. Henry stopped hovering so obsessively over Clara and the baby, handing off the day-to-day oversight to the French woman. His journal entries from May and early June suggest things had calmed down a bit. He was getting back to running the plantation and trying to patch up relationships with the neighboring landowners. But that calm got completely shattered in late June when an unexpected visitor showed up at the plantation, Margaret Duval, Richard's widow, who had been staying with relatives in Charleston since her husband's death. No record exists of what was said between Henry and his sister-in-law, but the aftermath makes it obvious the conversation was explosive. Margaret didn't even stay the night despite how far she had traveled. Within hours of her leaving, Henry ordered the overseer to put Clara under guard. Madame Beaumont was fired with 1 month's pay and a very stern warning about keeping her mouth shut. Henry's writings in the days after that visit show a man completely consumed by paranoia. "She knows," he wrote over and over, or suspects, which amounts to the same. "The resemblance is too strong to deny. She will return, perhaps with authorities. Preparations must be made." The preparations Henry was talking about appear to have been plans to move Clara and the child somewhere else entirely. Maps found in his papers show routes heading toward Texas, which was still its own independent republic at the time and out of reach of American authorities. Notes about costs and supplies suggest he intended to send them west with a trusted guide, though whether Clara knew about or agreed to any of this isn't clear. Those preparations, however, never got finished. On the evening of July 3, 1845, a fire broke out in the east wing of the Duval plantation house. It was spotted just after midnight by a field worker who was coming back from visiting his wife on a neighboring plantation. By the time he raised the alarm and everyone was woken up, the east wing was almost completely swallowed by flames. According to witness accounts gathered by local authorities, Henry ran into the burning building, supposedly to rescue Clara and the baby. None of the three came out. When the fire was finally put out in the early morning hours, 3 bodies were pulled from the ruins, an adult male identified as Henry Duval by his signet ring, an adult female assumed to be Clara, though the severe burning made it impossible to be sure, and the remains of an infant about 6 months old. The official report filed by the parish sheriff on July 10th ruled the fire an accident, probably caused by an overturned lamp. That conclusion was accepted without much question, possibly because of the Duval family's status in the community, or maybe just because most people didn't want to dig too deep into something this messy. The bodies were buried on the plantation grounds, Henry in the family plot, and Clara and the baby in unmarked graves at the edge of the property, a detail that Mrs. Montgomery wrote in her diary she found deeply wrong, feeling that regardless of station, the woman and innocent babe deserved Christian burial. With no direct heirs, the Duval plantation passed to a cousin from the Virginia branch of the family, who sold it less than a year later to a family from Alabama. The new owners reportedly kept hearing unexplained noises in the rebuilt East Wing and eventually gave up using those rooms for anything but storage, until the whole house was finally scheduled for demolition in 1963. And the story might have ended right there, turned into local legend and slowly forgotten, if it hadn't been for 2 additional documents found in that hidden cache that poke some serious holes in the official story of what happened that July night. The first is a receipt from a steamboat captain, dated July 2, 1845, the day before the fire, acknowledging payment for passage for one woman and infant from the St. Francisville landing to Natchez, with connecting passage arranged to New Orleans. The receipt is signed by Henry Duval. The second is a fragment of a letter, partially burned along one edge, written in handwriting that experts identified as Clarara's. Dated simply July, it reads, "The arrangements have been made as you directed. We will depart tomorrow before dawn. Your generosity will not be forgotten, though I cannot ever forgive what brought us to this point. May God have mercy on both our souls for what we have done and what we have failed to do." These two documents point to a story completely different from the official version. They raise the very real possibility that Clarara and her baby had already escaped before the fire, that they were never in that east wing when it burned, and that the bodies found in the ruins were not theirs. If that's true, then who the third body was is a complete mystery, and so is what really happened to Clarara and her son. Local historians have floated different theories. Some think Henry arranged a way for Clarara and the child to get out safely, but the plan somehow went wrong. Others suggest a darker possibility, that Henry, after learning Margaret had figured out his secret and fearing the social and legal fallout, may have chosen to end his own life and staged it to look like Clarara and the baby had died with him, giving them a clean getaway without anyone chasing them. The truth may never be fully known. The Duval plantation house is long gone. The land is now part of a modern farming operation. The graves, if they still exist, have never been found or dug up. The documents were studied by historians in the 1960s and then archived at the State Historical Society, where they've mostly collected dust outside of academic circles. Yet the story lives on in the oral traditions of St. Francisville. Some residents claim that on hot summer nights, especially around the anniversary of the fire, you can hear the sound of a woman singing a lullaby near where the east wing used to stand. Others describe a feeling of being watched when they pass the old plantation grounds, like something or someone is still standing guard over secrets buried long ago. Maybe the most intriguing clue of all comes from records of a small African-American church in Cincinnati, Ohio, dated 1852, which lists among its members a woman named Clarara and her son Richard. The church records note they had arrived from the South some years earlier, and that the boy was being educated at a school for free black children. The woman was described as literate and skilled in household management. Could this have been Clarara Mayfield and the baby boy born on the Duval plantation? The name Richard, the same as Henry's dead brother, would be a pretty meaningful choice if it was her. But like so much of this story, it stays a tantalizing possibility rather than a confirmed fact. What is certain is that the events at the Duval plantation in 1844 and 1845 capture so much of the moral complexity and human tragedy of the antebellum South. The relationship between Richard Duval and Clarara Mayfield, whatever its nature, Henry's reaction to the child he believed to be his brother's son, the fire that may have been an accident, a murder, a suicide, or an elaborate escape plan, all of it speaks to the deep distortions of humanity that slavery both created and demanded. In the end, maybe the most honest summary of this dark chapter in Louisiana history comes from Martha, the former cook who lived long enough to see emancipation. When asked about the events at the Duval plantation, she reportedly said, "There are some sins that burn too hot for this world to contain. Sometimes they burn right through, leaving nothing but ash and questions that ain't never going to be answered this side of Judgment Day." The land where the Duval plantation once stood looks completely ordinary to anyone passing by today. Crops grow, seasons change, and most people drive right past without a second glance. But for those who know the story, those quiet fields seem to hold their secrets tight, a reminder that history's darkest chapters are often written not in official records, but in the spaces between what got documented and what was deliberately left out. In 1968, a graduate student researching antebellum plantation life claimed to have found more Duval family documents in a private collection in Virginia. But before he could publish anything, he dropped out of his program, citing personal reasons. The documents he said he found were never located, and some scholars question whether they ever existed at all. His last academic letter, sent to his advisor at Tulane University, had a strange postscript. "I've decided to redirect my research away from the Duval matter. Some doors once opened cannot easily be closed again. Some questions once asked follow you into the dark." That abandoned research might have been the final chapter in the Duval story if it hadn't been for something that started in the spring of 1969. A woman named Elenina Beaumont, claiming to be a descendant of the French household manager briefly hired by Henry Duval, reached out to the Louisiana Historical Society offering to donate some family papers she thought might be useful for their archives. Among those papers was a journal kept by Madame Beaumont during her short time working at the Duval Plantation and in the years that followed. The journal, written in French and later translated by scholars at Tulane University, provides a perspective on events that had been completely missing from the historical record up to that point. According to Madame Beaumont's account, the baby Clara was indeed Richard Duval's son, conceived in a relationship that, while not truly consensual in any real sense given that Clara was enslaved, had developed over several months before Richard's death. The elder Mr. Duval, she wrote, spoke often of his intention to purchase the woman's freedom and establish her in a house in New Orleans where he might visit their child without scandal. Whether this was a genuine intention or merely a means of securing her cooperation, I cannot say. Richard's sudden death, which Madame Beaumont suggests was not caused by fever or a duel, but was actually a deliberate act of self-harm following a confrontation with his wife Margaret, who had discovered the relationship, left Clara in an incredibly vulnerable position. According to the journal, Richard had already arranged for Clara to be sold to the Mississippi Plantation as a temporary measure, with plans to set her up in New Orleans once Margaret had gone back to her family in Charleston. Henry's discovery of his brother's private papers after his death revealed not only the relationship but also those plans. His initial reaction, according to Madame Beaumont, was a combination of moral outrage and serious concern for the family's reputation. Mr. Henry Duval spoke of his brother's conduct in terms of the strongest condemnation, she wrote, yet I observed that his gaze would often linger on the woman's growing belly, and there was something in his manner that suggested not merely righteous anger, but a deeper, more personal disturbance. The most revealing parts of Madame Beaumont's journal were about the weeks right before the fire. She writes that Henry had become increasingly out of control, swinging back and forth between cold, calculated thinking and intense emotional outbursts. According to her account, he had started referring to the unborn baby as the last Duval, despite the fact that the child's mixed parentage and illegitimacy would have made that an absolutely impossible claim in the legal and social world of the time. Even more disturbing were his late-night trips to the East Wing, where Madame Beaumont said he would sit for hours outside Clara's room, sometimes talking quietly to himself or to some invisible presence he called Richard. On one occasion, she reported finding him holding the baby, then about 5 months old, at an open window in the middle of the night, staring out into the darkness as if he was thinking about doing something terrible. It was that incident that pushed her to go talk to Clara and offer to help. I told her I feared for the safety of both her and the child, Madame Beaumont wrote. Mr. Duval's behavior had become increasingly unpredictable, and I had reason to believe he might be capable of harm despite his apparent concern for their welfare. According to the journal, Clara had already come to the same conclusion on her own. She told Madame Beaumont that she had overheard Mr. Duval talking to what he believed was his brother's ghost. Madame Beaumont recorded, he spoke of sending the child to join its father and of cleansing the family line. She understood, as did I, that these were not merely the ramblings of a disturbed mind, but potentially deadly intentions. Together, they came up with a plan. Madame Beaumont would use her day off to go to St. Francisville and buy passage on a steamboat headed to Natchez. Clara and the baby would be sneaked out of the house before dawn on the planned day, with the help of Martha, who had connections among the riverboat workers. The plan was set in motion, but then hit an unexpected snag when Margaret Duval showed up. Contrary to what the official story suggests, Margaret hadn't come to confront Henry about Clara and the child. According to Madame Beaumont, she had actually come to offer a solution. She would take the child north, where it could be placed with a family that would raise it as their own, taking the whole messy situation off the Duval family's hands entirely. Henry's reaction to this proposal was immediate and violent. He accused Margaret of trying to steal the last pure Duval blood and threatened to expose her own secrets if she didn't leave immediately and never come back. This confrontation, which Madame Beaumont watched from the next room, confirmed her worst fears about how far gone Henry really was mentally. The planned escape was sped up. Instead of waiting for the scheduled departure date, Madame Beaumont arranged for Clara and the baby to be taken to the river landing that very night. She would follow the next day after collecting the rest of her pay and packing her things in a way that wouldn't raise any suspicions. What happened next is described by Madame Beaumont in journal entries she wrote several days after the fire, by which point she had already reached New Orleans. According to her account, Clara and the baby were successfully gotten out of the plantation and onto the steamboat which headed upriver toward Natchez right on schedule. Madame Beaumont stayed behind, planning to leave the following morning. She was woken up in the middle of the night by the smell of smoke and the sound of shouting. From her window she could see the east wing on fire. In the chaos that followed, she saw Henry not running toward the fire as was later reported, but running away from it, toward the family cemetery where Richard was buried. Madame Beaumont used the chaos to leave the plantation immediately, taking only what she could carry and walked to St. Francisville on foot. There she got on the first boat heading to New Orleans, where she later heard that Henry had reportedly died in the fire. Her journal entries make it pretty clear she wasn't buying that story. "I cannot be certain of what occurred after my departure," she wrote, "but I know with absolute certainty that Clara and the child were not in the east wing when the fire began. They were miles away on a steamboat bound for Natchez. If bodies resembling theirs were found in the ruins, they must have been other unfortunates whose identities were obscured by the flames." As for Henry, Madame Beaumont wonders whether he actually did die in the fire, maybe going back into the burning building for some unknown reason, or whether he used the fire as cover to disappear, a theory that gets some support from reported sightings of a man who looked like Henry in New Orleans in the months after the fire, though those sightings can't be verified. The Beaumont Journal gives us a really compelling alternative to the official story, but like all historical sources, it needs to be looked at carefully. Madame Beaumont was writing after the fact, possibly already knowing how events had been publicly reported. The fact that she helped plan the escape means she had every reason to paint herself in a good light. And the journal itself, while experts who have examined it believe it's authentic, can't be definitively proven to date from that exact period. Yet the journal's account lines up with certain established facts: the steamboat receipt found among Henry's papers, Clara's partially burned letter, and the church records from Cincinnati that might show where she and her son ended up. It also explains things that the official story never could, like whose bodies were actually found in the fire and why Henry had been acting so unhinged in the weeks leading up to it. Maybe most importantly, the Beaumont Journal adds a whole other dimension to this story, one that goes beyond the personal tragedy of the people directly involved and speaks to the broader moral catastrophe that was the institution of slavery, and what it did to everyone caught up in it, enslaved and enslaver alike. The journal's final entry related to the Duval matter, dated December 25, 1845, records a brief encounter in New Orleans. "Today, while attending Christmas service at the cathedral, I glimpsed a woman who bore a striking resemblance to her. She was accompanied by a male child of appropriate age. Our eyes met briefly across the crowded space, and I believe recognition passed between us. Though no acknowledgement was made, she was dressed in the manner of a free woman of color of modest means, and the child appeared healthy and well cared for. I did not approach, as I believe both of us prefer that certain connections remain unacknowledged. Some secrets are better kept, not for the protection of the guilty, but for the peace of those who have already suffered enough." Whether this glimpse was truly Clara and her son, whether they eventually made their way to Cincinnati as the church records suggest, whether they lived out the rest of their lives in freedom or faced more hardships, these questions have no definitive answers. The historical record, always incomplete, is especially thin when it comes to the lives of people who existed at the edges of society. The Duval plantation itself left very few physical traces behind. The land was broken up and sold in the early 1900s. The family cemetery was moved to a church in St. Francisville. The ruins of the house were eventually cleared away completely. Today, the site is marked only by a small historical plaque noting that a plantation once stood there, with absolutely no mention of what happened there in 1844 and 1845. Yet the story has kept living on in the oral traditions of St. Francisville, passed down through generations of residents, each one adding their own take and embellishments. Some versions say the fire was set deliberately by other enslaved people on the plantation as an act of resistance or revenge. Others suggest Margaret Duval came back with authorities or hired men who started the blaze. Still others lean into the supernatural, Richard's ghost driving his brother to madness, or Henry performing dark rituals trying to communicate with the dead. These different versions reflect not just how memory changes over time and how people reshape stories, but also how hard it is to face a history built on fundamental injustice. The story of Henry Duval, Clarara Mayfield, and the child born between two worlds is at its core a story about the impossibility of keeping any real human connection alive inside a system specifically designed to deny the humanity of those it enslaved. In 1972, a descendant of the Montgomery family, whose plantation had been right next door to the Duvals, donated more papers to the state archives. Among them was a letter written by Eliza Montgomery to her sister in Virginia, dated September 1845, 2 months after the fire. In it, she mentions hearing from a reliable source in New Orleans that a woman matching Clarara's description had been seen boarding a ship bound for Liverpool, accompanied by a child and a French-speaking woman who might have been Madame Beaumont. "If it is indeed the woman I suspect," Mrs. Montgomery wrote, "then I can only thank Providence for her escape from that house of shadows. There was a sickness there that had nothing to do with fever or physical ailment, a sickness of the soul that infected all who dwelled within those walls. Henry Duval was a man consumed by his brother's sins and his own, unable to distinguish between justice and vengeance, between protection and possession. If the woman and her innocent child have indeed found their way to distant shores, I pray they find there the peace and liberty that was denied them here. The possibility that Clarara and her son might have made it all the way to England opens up yet another thread of the story. The United Kingdom had abolished slavery throughout its territories in 1833, and Liverpool, though it had historically been a center of the slave trade, had by the 1840s become home to a small but significant community of free black individuals, some of whom had escaped from American slavery. Records from a parish in Liverpool show the baptism in April 1846 of a boy named Richard, approximately 15 months old, born to a mother named Clarara. The child's last name is listed as Freeman, a name that formerly enslaved people commonly chose, and one that makes a pretty powerful statement about newfound liberty. No father is named in the baptismal record. Further traces of their lives get harder and harder to follow from there. Britain's census records from 1851 list a Clarara Freeman described as a seamstress, born in the United States, living in a modest house in Liverpool with a child of approximately 6 years. By the 1861 census, they no longer show up, having perhaps moved somewhere else in Britain, returned to the United States after emancipation, or possibly died in one of the disease outbreaks that swept through cities during that period. If Clarara and her son did make it to England and built lives there, they would have escaped not only the immediate danger they faced at the Duval plantation, but also the decades of legal enslavement followed by segregation and racial violence that would have been their likely fate had they stayed in the American South. The child born into a system that defined him as property might instead have grown up in a society where, while certainly not free from prejudice, he would have had legal rights and opportunities that were completely unimaginable on the plantation where he was born. This possibility that from the ashes of the Duval plantation might have come not just survival but a real kind of freedom offers a rare glimpse of something like hope in a story otherwise filled with moral failure and human suffering. It suggests that even inside systems designed to strip people of agency and humanity, individuals could still find ways to resist, to escape, to build lives on their own terms. Yet it remains just that, a possibility, not a certainty. The historical record, with all its gaps and silences, its biases and blind spots, cannot give us definitive answers. We know that Henry Duval purchased Clarara Mayfield for 12 cents in 1844. We know that a child was born. We know that a fire destroyed the east wing of the plantation house in July 1845. Beyond those bare facts lies a whole realm of interpretation, speculation, and what-ifs. Maybe this uncertainty is actually fitting. The story of the Duval plantation is in so many ways a story about secrets, about what gets hidden, what gets revealed, what gets preserved, and what gets destroyed. The hidden documents, the unacknowledged relationships, the suppressed truths, the stories constructed to protect social standing and family reputations, all of it speaks to the elaborate machinery of denial that kept the institution of slavery running and continues to shape how we understand its legacy today. In 2002, an archaeological survey was done on part of the former Duval plantation land to prepare for a highway expansion project. Among the findings were the foundations of what appeared to be the east wing of the main house, with clear evidence of the fire that had destroyed it. Beneath the charred remains, in what would have been a space between the walls, workers found a small metal box containing three things: a child's shoe, a man's pocket watch with the initials RD engraved on the case, and a folded piece of paper. The paper was badly deteriorated but still partially readable, and appeared to be a note written in a woman's handwriting. The few words that could be deciphered read, "May God forgive what we have done, the truth will come in blood and fire." These artifacts, now preserved in the State Museum, raise more questions than they answer. Who put them in the wall and when? What truth did the writer believe would come out in blood and fire? Was it Clara leaving behind a final testament before her escape? Was it Henry in a moment of clarity or guilt? Was it someone else entirely, maybe Martha, or another member of the household who knew far more than they ever publicly let on? Like so much of the Duval Plantation story, these questions stay open, the full truth just barely out of reach. The land where the house once stood has been paved over now. The highway carries thousands of travelers every day over ground that once witnessed a family's unraveling and perhaps a woman and child's journey toward freedom. Most of those passing by have no idea what happened there, and even fewer stop to think about what it means. Yet for those who study the past not just as a collection of facts but as a mirror that shows us something about ourselves, the story of Henry Duval and Clara Mayfield stays deeply relevant. It speaks to the complexity of human relationships, to the damage done by systems of oppression on both the oppressed and the oppressor, to the persistence of memory even when there are serious efforts to erase it. In the fall of 2022, a woman visited the state archives and asked to see all materials related to the Duval Plantation. She identified herself as a graduate student researching antebellum Louisiana. But archive staff noted later that she asked no questions about farming practices, economic systems, or the architecture of the buildings, the usual stuff researchers ask about. Instead, she focused entirely on the personal papers, the journals, the letters, the accounts of the fire. After several days of research, she approached the head archivist with a remarkable claim. She believed she was a descendant of Clara Mayfield and her son Richard, tracing her family line through the Liverpool connection and eventually back to the United States in the early 20th century. She had grown up hearing fragments of a family story about ancestors who had escaped from a plantation fire, though the details had gotten fuzzy over the generations. When asked what had made her search specifically this plantation out of the hundreds that had existed in Louisiana, she pulled out a small silver locket. Inside was a tiny miniature portrait of a man in early 19th century clothing. Though faded with age, his features were still clear: a high forehead, deep-set eyes, a certain tension around the mouth. On the back of the locket, barely visible, were engraved the initials RD. "My grandmother gave me this," the woman said. "She told me it had been passed down through the women in our family for generations. She said it was a reminder of where we came from and of how far we had traveled to be free." The archivist, who had spent decades working with the historical materials of the region, examined the locket carefully. He couldn't authenticate it on the spot, of course. Proper verification would need expert analysis. But he acknowledged that the style and craftsmanship were consistent with the period, and the likeness did bear a certain resemblance to the few existing descriptions of Richard Duval. "If this is genuine," he told the woman, "then you're holding a remarkable piece of history, not just of your family, but of this region, this country." The woman nodded. "History isn't just what's written in the official records," she said. "It's what's remembered, what's passed down, what survives despite everything that conspires to erase it." She declined to leave the locket for further study, saying it was too personal, too precious to hand over, even temporarily. Instead, she let photographs be taken for the archives and promised to think about more formal authentication later. Before leaving, she asked to see the small metal box found during the archaeological survey, the one containing the child's shoe, the pocket watch, and the fragmentary note. Standing in front of the museum display case, she looked at those artifacts for a long time without saying anything. "What do you think it means?" the archivist finally asked. "The note, the buried box, what do you think they were trying to preserve or communicate?" The woman thought about it. "I think," she said slowly, "that someone wanted to make sure that even if the official story was accepted, even if appearances were maintained and reputations preserved, there would still be this physical evidence that would raise questions, that would resist the neat conclusions, that would keep the truth, whatever it might be, from being entirely buried." She looked once more at the tiny shoe, the watch, the paper with its few legible words. "Maybe that's all we can really hope for," she said. "Not complete answers, but enough fragments to keep us questioning, to remind us that history is always more complex, more human than the stories we tell ourselves about it. With that, she thanked the archivist and left, taking with her the locket that might or might not establish a direct line between the present day and the events at the Duval Plantation more than 175 years earlier. The archivist, watching her go, felt a strange sensation, not quite déjà vu, but something close to it. He had the sudden, irrational feeling that he had seen this scene before, or would see it again, a person coming to search for answers about the Duval Plantation, finding some threads but never the complete picture, and leaving with more questions than they'd arrived with. It was as if the story was somehow still unfolding, still looking for its resolution, the people long dead but their actions still rippling outward through time, as if the fire that consumed the east wing of that plantation house had never really gone out but was still burning somewhere, casting light and shadow across the decades, illuminating some parts of the truth while leaving others in the dark. The woman's visit was duly noted in the archive's records, one more layer added to the accumulation of documents, artifacts, and testimonies that make up our imperfect understanding of the past. Her photographs of the locket were filed away, her connection to Clara Mayfield and the child neither proven nor disproven. And the story of Henry Duval, who purchased a pregnant enslaved woman for 12 cents and thereby set in motion a chain of events that would culminate in fire and disappearance, remains what it has always been, a whisper from the shadows of American history, a tale told in fragments and silences, in what was documented and what was deliberately left unsaid. For those who listen closely, it speaks still of the prices paid in suffering, in blood, in fire for the sins of the past, and of the long, difficult journey towards something that might, with enough distance and courage, eventually resemble redemption.